Future. All right, here we go. Okay, so a couple things in real fast. Remember that Gilded Age thing is due. I had a chance to check it today, but you still have a chance for extra credit if you get those Gilded Age notes before Friday. Every day, closer to Friday, a little less, but. And also, there's a few pages left in chapter, trying to get my chapter number. The book does a weird thing. It goes Reconstruction, and then it goes to Industrialization, and then it goes to the New South. Why? I don't know. It should be in order. But you have a few pages left in chapter 18, which is on the New West. So please finish that. I was going to start the New West, but we ended up talking about the New South all day first. And my mask broke this morning. I had to use a paper mask, so I'm very sad. This little thing snapped. Then I tried to tie it because I like that mask, and I pulled it out of its thing. I was very annoyed. I love that mask. No, I don't love the mask, any mask, but that's a mask that works. So I have to go paper, and those of you who use the paper know how every breath is kind of, you breathe in a little bit of the particulate. I mean, it's just, but that's why I had to box up just in case. Don't you feel bad for me that I wear my mask? Yeah, that's really sincere nods. Some of you aren't even kind of, whatever. Okay, so finish up the New South and hopefully get to the West. We'll see. And we got the sharecroppers. What was it called where you gave up your part of your what you grew as collateral if you're a tenant farmer? What was that called? Well, sharecropping is where you have to give up a whole share. Your collateral, what was that called? Yeah, crop lien. So basically what it is, the bank or the creditor, in this case it's almost always the landlord, put a lien on your crop. So like if you borrow money, put your car up with collateral, they have a lien on your car. Kind of, I know the term doesn't make sense, but to our point of view, it's lien, but that's what it means. And who was elected president in 1876? Yeah, Rutherford B. Hayes. Reed only run one term, and in it, Southern Democrats said we won't totally disrupt Congress if we allow him to be president. And what did Northern Republicans agree to end? Yeah, even though it didn't happen overnight, it's going to take 20 years. But the establishment of what were those laws that segregated the South called? Yeah, the Jim Crow laws. And it's important to understand about that. It's more than just segregating. As awful as that is, it's more than just having separate facilities. It is not allowing a huge part of the society participate in the daily practice of commerce. How could you possibly start a business if you can't participate in normal commerce and interaction in the market when you're not allowed in 3/4 of the market? And don't forget, not only is this heavily regulated by the federal government, so you're basically saying you can't participate in your government, that's where money comes from. It gets its value from taxes and government. So basically this is just icing out an entire group of people to never participate in government, in commerce. So we got sharecroppers, we got Jim Crow laws. Do we get the voter suppression? Do we hear? Yeah. Do we get to this? All right, we're okay. So voter suppression, and the whole goal is to get rid of the Republican Party in the South and keep blacks from voting. So we got. Did we even mention the grandfather's clause? And don't forget the poll tax. Grandpa. And then you got the heck out of here. All right. And the grandfather's clause, it's a part of the Mississippi Plan, basically said this: if your grandfather didn't vote, you have to pass a literacy test to vote. If your grandfather didn't vote, and whose grandfathers couldn't vote? Yeah, especially slaves, but also new immigrants too. But technically, whites in the South could, even though some obviously couldn't. But everybody who was black had to pass this test. And the literacy test, don't think in terms of like your ability to read or write. It's your literacy or knowledge of the government. And this test was so it would be termed, it's kind of archaic now, but a civics exam. So you have to have knowledge of state and national government. And the test was specifically designed to be impossible to pass. Impossible to pass. They didn't want people to pass it. And the joke was the people administering the test could not pass the test. And I know Mr. Zarnowski has a couple different versions of this test, so he likes to give his AP government class that. And I think he has Alabama and the Mississippi one. And trust me, nobody will pass it. Nobody will pass it. I guarantee you most adults you know would not pass it. Not because they're not smart, it's just these very minuscule little bits of almost trivia to make sure you can't pass. Eventually this we found mostly unconstitutional, but the legacy would remain. And the net effect of this is, and I did not type this in, so please write this in, by the turn of the century, so going into the 20th century, 95% of blacks in the South could not vote. 95%. And those who did vote were taking their life in their hands. So let's be clear about it. And so this effectively destroyed all that they had fought for, all they had suffered through. The efforts of Reconstruction would be lost. And the right to vote, well, not the right to vote. Remember, there is no right to vote. That's a big hole in the Constitution. But the vote would not be, or blacks could not vote in the South until 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. Kind of a big deal. And big elements of the Voting Rights Act were thrown up on the Supreme Court 8 years ago. And that's one of the first laws right now, literally, that the House of Representatives passed, but it probably won't get through the Senate right now. So it's kind of interesting how this keeps cycling around. It's not like it's like, oh, it's a done deal. And so with that, I like this poster, first off. One vote less. Very effective. This is from Harper's Magazine, or this is the Richmond Whig, I'm sorry, but it was posted in the Harper's Magazine. Harper's Magazine, at that time, would always have political cartoons from all over the country. And so you have, this was a Republican paper for a while. Then it would be gone in the South. Here, hat in hand. They always draw it as, try to make them, it's a little bit classist when it was the elite whites, but coming to beg to vote. And not going to happen. And so with that, we're going to jump right to this. But one of the big things that really hit, that confirmed Reconstruction was over, was a series of insurrections. The most famous being in Wilmington, North Carolina. These insurrections here. All over North Carolina, there was a victory of what's called the Fusion Party. Now the Fusion Party were kind of a branch of the Democrats called Populists. These are farmers and working people. We'll talk about the Populists in a little bit. And Republicans. They joined together, thus fusion. So, and who are the Republicans? In North Carolina, the blacks who could still vote. And some whites. So you have poor whites and blacks unifying together. By the way, this was a real threat to the Democratic Party in the South, as you can see by this poster right here. Sorry about that. Don't be tempted by the devil. And it's the fusionist as Satan. Yeah.
So the fusionists, mostly black Republicans, some Democrats.
Yeah, some and poor farmers. North Carolina, the Populists tried to get factory workers in the north. It failed miserably, but it was mostly poor farmers. the Populist Party would be really big in the state, a relatively new state called Montana at that time. So it was a nationwide party. So they actually won in North Carolina. And what happened was immediate claim of black misrule. So I showed you this picture before, but I decided to put it here again because they drew this thing of Negro rule. This was in North Carolina to protest the Fusion Party. Look what happens, you let this monster loose. So you know, it's that picture and Beelzebub, the devil right there. And so a call went out for whites to come reestablish white rule. You can see it right there. Attention, white men. And a meeting in, this appears to be working. Okay. A meeting in Wilmington. Now, this is all over the state. But Wilmington was first. And big thing is this how terrorism works. You terrify people so they will just quit. They're scared for their lives and allow for something else to happen. And by the way, if there's any doubt what they were fighting for, a full attendance desired as business in the furtherance of white supremacy will be transacted. So there's little doubt what they were fighting for in 1898. And when the insurrection happened, it would turn out to be a very bloody, bloody coup. At least 9 African Americans would be shot. The government would be removed by, this is the mob. This is this is a black-owned business that was burnt down. They overturned the government, and you can see them all with the rifles. That's in Wilmington. Overthrew it, shot them down, and this is the New York Herald. Whites killed Negroes and seized control of Wilmington. Yeah, they took over the government, and you can imagine what happened. All these fusion governments just collapsed. So basically, this was a coup in the United States, overthrowing a democratically elected government. And who's to blame? This was in the New York Times. New York Times was not near as big a newspaper today as, or near as big a newspaper than it is now. It's a relatively small newspaper, but it's not hiding who it was blamed. When it got back, North Carolina authorities, the new government said, oh, this is what happens when you give them power. So this is one example that happened. This would trigger events all over the South. And that would kind of symbolically be the end of any chance of anything but white rule. So this ended the fusion governments all across the South. The Populists took a big hit. They were a pretty big party. They made a mistake in the election of 1896. I'll tell you about that later. Okay, maybe not. That's a little bit too far. But this destroyed it. You know, trying to get working class people together and then would all break down on race. So what we're going to have in the South, and we'll see it developing after the Civil War, would be the Solid South. The Democratic Party controlled the South. And remember, the Republicans are the party of Lincoln. And so this was the segregationist party in the South. And they were very much at odds with Northern Democrats. Many Northern Democrats throughout the entire 20th century were against Jim Crow laws. So you have this weird kind of marriage between them. So, for example, Franklin Roosevelt during the New Deal had to, or couldn't do too much for civil rights because of that. And here's John Kennedy, a very liberal Democrat from Massachusetts who very vocally came up for civil rights, and there he's having to campaign in Georgia. By the way, you know it's a Georgia flag. They just put the Confederate battle flag as part of it to be against civil rights. That's why they had it. So just before that, that's 1960. And they would be solidly Democratic until 1964. When Northern Democrats and there's a huge Democratic majority in 1964, but Northern Democrats and most Republicans, but no, it was mostly Northern Democrats, passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and that would begin the end of the Solid South for the Democrats. The Republican Party, starting with Barry Goldwater, who ran for president in 1964, came out against the Civil Rights Act, and today the Republican Party is now very Southern Party. So things have kind of changed there. We'll talk about that. It's called the Southern Strategy. It's a whole thing. We get to the 60s. Okay, so the New South will coincide with the most racist time in history. In history. It's no coincidence. This would be the same time that the American Indians on the plains would be absolutely destroyed by the United States in its conquest. You're going to get colonization all over Africa and Asia by Europeans who have the advantage of the technology at that time. And the establishment of Jim Crows and keeping people who are not white out of most northern cities. This was an intensely racist time symbolized by this horrific act, a lynching. And lynching is torturing somebody to death, almost always personified by hanging. And look at this, the kids are smiling. They would sell postcards to these. They would turn them into a big event. They'd have a picnic along with a lynching, a torturing of somebody to death, meant to terrify people who might demand their rights, or in the rights could be any number of things, from having the right to vote to marrying who you want to marry. But yeah, that kid is far too happy. And these murders are state crime. And so in these states, nobody was ever arrested. In fact, lynching is just 2 years ago that the Senate finally voted to have an anti-lynching bill. 2 years ago, to make it a federal crime. And there's still a significant number of Southern senators who voted against it. This is a horrific one. Hung and then burnt. And look at them posed with the body. And there are all kinds of lynching. I'll tell you another one about it. Got some connection to this. I mean, a little bit of one. Here is what the NAACP put up, and it shows the known lynching for these 30 years of Texas hotbed of lynching. And Montana, oh yeah. Heck, Helena was about 15% of the population was African American in 1890. In 20 years, less than one. Why? A few lynchings and they ran out of town. Ran out of town. In fact, it's no coincidence that they're run out of town. Oh, we'll get to that. Remember that moment. I jumped the gun. And a lot of lynching. And there's other, this doesn't count beatings, people disappearing, but it kind of personified this. In fact, the NAACP, we'll talk about them more later, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, awkward name, they would keep a flag up in their headquarters in New York City. And the flag said a man was lynched today. In the 1920s, every day. That flag would be up. And so with that, and remember what I said about the racist time? I tried to find a better version of this, but I don't get the old Almay stock photo. But the Mississippi plans or rights being deprived of freedmen. But the same thing was happening in California to Asian Americans, mostly Chinese Americans who came to work on the railroad. Same thing happened in Helena. Helena had a huge population of Chinese immigrants, and all were run out of town. But there's elements of the old underground town where the Chinese were allowed to work still in downtown Helena. Some of the stores, some of the places downtown, you can go tour some of those places. I mean, they're just kind of rooms now. Pretty old, decrepit rooms, but at least that's where they were. And we'll jump right here. That's in Omaha, Nebraska. My mom was a little girl when that happened. And so this is not that long ago. And the legacy of this exists. That was a pretty shocking one. But you catch that? They voted. Let's be clear about it. Well, in 1896, so a little bit before, but we got to put this in here. A very important court case was brought up. Homer Plessy. And they found him for a number of reasons, and the railroad tried to get him to protest segregated railroads because of Jim Crow. The railroads, and this is a branch of the Southern Pacific, it's really expensive to have separate cars for whites and non-whites. And Homer Plessy was like, and we've talked about this before with the fornication laws. Virtually everybody who was a descendant of slave has both European and African blood, because we talked about this. And so he was basically, in fact, they said that he looked white. And so he could he got on the white train and then announced that he was of African descent. Remember one of the legacies of slavery is just any bit of Africa or any African descent and you're black. But they show him a little bit darker here, and he announced it. So he would be arrested and they brought a suit. And the whole thing was this deprived the 14th Amendment. So this would go against those slaughterhouse cases. This was a big ruling. Well, the Supreme Court ruled 7-2. Republicans shrunk the Supreme Court, then they increased the size of the Supreme Court, and then they stuck on 9. This is during the Civil War. These are Republicans. Well, they said that separate but equal, aka segregation, as long as they're equal facilities, were constitutional. And this would set the stage then, basically confirming Jim Crow laws. That's why the Brown versus Topeka Board of Education in 1954 that at least began the process, and we'll talk more about Brown later, so don't worry about that. Began the process of integrating schools, at least a little bit, was such a big deal because it overturned this massive precedent, but only a very narrow part. It had nothing to do with like buses or trains or other things, but big case. And one more very important thing about this. By definition, this will never be equal. Even if the facilities for people who aren't white are the best facilities in the world, they'll never be equal. Because the reason they're separate goes back to that sign you saw from Wilmington. They put one race over the other. That's the reason they're separate. So by definition, they can never be equal. But that's another story for down the road. And this would begin the concept of the lost cause. And the lost cause myth will become to dominate not just the South at that time, but American history. To this day in many places. The lost cause. That the South was fighting this noble fight to defend themselves from Northern aggression. It was Northern aggression that started the Civil War. And all the South was trying to do was defend their way of life. And so the whole thing was a Northern attack. And that's why sometimes you see it called, I jumped the gun. So they were fighting for this, for states' rights went from being just pro-slavery to we're just defending our freedom from arrogant, rich, Northern bankers who wanted to destroy us. By the way, that would have been a shock to people in 1861 in the South who seceded, who made it very clear it was all about defending slavery. And that's where you get the term war between the states. That is part of the lost cause myth. Nobody called it the war between the states during the war. It was the Civil War or the War of the Rebellion. It was not the war between the states. But by saying this, it implies that it was just a fight between states trying to protect their rights. And I've had people correct me and tell me, no, it's not the Civil War, it's war between the states. And they also think they're really smart. It depends what mood I am, how I react. Because it offends me. And because that implies they were fighting this noble cause. And the symbol of that's going to be the Confederate battle flag. So here is a statue of the Confederacy in Virginia, and they brought the battle flag out. Here's the battle flag 2 years ago, being placed all over the Capitol in South Carolina. And one of the most popular songs in the South, and actually a very catchy tune, but after the Civil War was "Oh, I'm a good old rebel, and I'm not going to be reconstructed." I got to admit, it's a catchy tune. But thus the battle flag would become a symbol for the lost cause and then Jim Crow. And so here are people waving this flag, protesting. This is the 1965 March on Selma, Alabama for voting rights to push Congress for voting right. And this is 68 for housing rights. And the Confederate battle flag will be a symbol against civil rights. And so if somebody is carrying the Confederate battle flag, they want you to think something about them. They do. I mean, they want you to think. Either they want you to think what they think, Or they want you to think they don't know, they're not very bright. Okay, so with that, the Reconstruction myth. The Reconstruction myth fits in this very well. And this is this concept of this was a northern invasion. A northern invasion of the South. So that meant the whole goal of the Civil War was the North attack, force the South to secede, force the South to attack Fort Sumter, force them to start the war because the North wanted to defeat them so they can invade in Reconstruction and destroy Southern way of life, aka Southern whites. And therefore, Reconstruction, the myth is this was never a fight for equal rights and to reintegrate people into a new Southern economy. It was an invasion, a brutal invasion. And I got to be clear about something. This is a lie. It's not just, hey, we have a different interpretation. No, they're lying. This is a lie. Because that's not what happened. They're trying to hide what really happened. So they're lying. But in 1913, the first real motion picture was made. A silent movie called Birth of the Nation. And some of you might have heard of this movie. In my special topics class, where we do historical, different topics, some serious, some not serious. In fact, we just voted on that today, or yesterday, special topics. So we're doing everything from cults in American history of rock and roll to racism and the financial panic of 2008. So it's a big variety. We're doing a Cold War and horror movies right now. We're gonna watch a horror movie. But back to this. We try to watch Birth of a Nation. It's hard for us to watch silent movies. Have you ever tried to watch a full silent movie? It's disjointed and they all overact. Because they're silent. They make every mouth movement, really exaggerate. And they do this kind of weird overacting because they can't have sound. So it's just weird for our eyes. But at the time, this is the first real movie. This set the stage for all movies to follow would follow W.D. Griffith. It's an amazing bit of art. At the same time, one of the most racist movies of all time. And in it, he laid out Reconstruction. And the birth of the nation was the end of Reconstruction and the redemption of white rule. That's the birth of the nation. And it was based on a book called, well, the book is named after the heroes of the story, the Ku Klux Klan. The book it's based on is called The Klansman. The hero or the Klan who drove the United States out. Who are the enemy? The U.S., Northern soldiers, and of course, freedmen. And you notice this is clearly a Caucasian in blackface. And that was the norm. Anybody who was not white, at least if they had a speaking role in the movie, would be somebody who was white, and then if they're playing somebody of African descent, you'd blackface like this. If they're playing someone Asian, they'd squint. Yeah, it's pretty awful when you see that. If you play an American Indian, they have them get a good tan. Sure. And this movie was a hit. And this would create a sensation all over the United States. I can't even describe what a big deal it is. By the way, you notice the Klan here? You look at their hats. Doesn't it look like they have plungers on their heads? I got to admit, I appreciate the fact that the Klan has plungers on their head, but they're the heroes. The Klan died in 1872. It was basically forgotten. It reemerged after this movie. All over the United States, including a little town that happened to be the capital of Montana, Helena. Oh, this movie was big, big. And President Wilson, a Democrat who was from Virginia, but he was the governor of New Jersey, he was president when this came out, and he was an historian. But this is a quote from him they used in the movie. And it's hard to read because I expanded the screen, it got a little pixelated, but it says, the white men were roused by a mere instinct of self-preservation, until at last there had sprung into existence a great Ku Klux Klan, a veritable empire of the South to protect the Southern country. That's the president. He'd be the president who would bring Jim Crow laws to the federal government, including the brand new Lincoln Memorial. But yeah, I know the irony is pretty strong there. Wilson's an interesting guy. Yeah.
Didn't you want to know about these guys? was that a different president?
No, he did.
What was it for?
World War I, 14 points.
Um,
There's a lot of people. Wilson was an interesting guy. Not all was horrible. Some was horrible. But just because you win the Nobel Peace Prize doesn't necessarily mean you deserve it.
yeah.
And so with that, well, I already said it, I forgot it, but the Southern victory was by the Klan. So the Klan popped up all over the place. Boom, made its reemergence. Now we're in the South, where the Klan really hit it, were in the Plains, the Midwest, and the West. That's where the Klan became big. Only in Alabama and a little bit in Florida and Georgia where the Klan reemerged until the Civil Rights Movement. Then it came back with a vengeance. But we jump right to them. It's no coincidence that at the time of the establishment of Jim Crow, Confederate monuments popped up all over the place. The first Confederate monuments, and there weren't very many, there were a few, 1870s, were to memorialize those who had fought. In the North, there's also a little bit of the North, triumphant, be very triumphant, we won the war. I gotta admit, I like in Washington, D.C., seeing all the Union generals on horseback. I do like that. General Meade, the hero of Gettysburg, is surrounded by naked angels, and it's very weird. But here is Robert E. Lee Circle. These started popping up here as symbols of the lost cause. But not only that, to enforce Jim Crow. Lee Circle in Richmond was just on the edge of the segregated black neighborhood. So this was a sign to them, hey, who's in charge? We know what they fought for, and we put a statue right up here. I mean, it was meant to be a symbol. And statues popped up all over. There's Lee in Charlottesburg. Here is a bronze statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest, the cavalry leader in the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan in Tennessee. Here's Forrest statue and the Klan meeting in front of him in the state capitol of Tennessee. It's still there, but they voted to put a curtain in front of it. That picture was in 1974, not that long ago. And so just began a wave of statues. That's when all the statues came out. So there was controversy about statues coming down, especially in the last couple of years, these Confederate statues. Well, this is when they came up. They came up at that time. There was a big wave right at Birth of the Nation, including this one. Birth of a Nation, 3 years later in Helena, Montana. Confederate statue, Confederate monument went up. 2 years ago, the city council voted to take it down. So that was all Birth of a Nation. They came out, made a big presentation. The Klan came out, the new Klan in Helena. Yeah, the furthest north Confederate statue in the United States. So it was a pretty broad change. And that's time for me to show you the ugliest Confederate memorial. It's routinely covered with red paint, so it's hard to get a real picture of it. But this is Nathan Bedford Forrest in Nashville, Tennessee. And I have problems with a lot of statues now. And Forrest was a horrible man. But you know what? If that wants to be people's memory of Forrest, why not? And if you see it in person, it's creepier than the picture. The picture does not do it justice on the creepiness. And so let's jump right to this. One more thing I have to tell you about is a book called Gone with the Wind. Few things have done more to push the lost cause. This is the lost cause, it's the Gone with the Wind myth. So it's a book by Margaret Mitchell, and it romanticizes the South. And they made it into a huge motion picture, one of the first color movies. And here are a couple of screens from it. This is a black and white still from it. And here the heroes were the slave owners and their families. The slaves all loved slavery. The villains were Northern soldiers, and the slaves loved slavery. And this is the very beginning of the movie. They have the scroll down. The pretty world of gallantry took its last bow. Here was the last ever to be seen of knights and their ladies fair, of master and of slave. Wow. Has anyone seen it? It's what, 4 or 5 days long?
Yeah.
It's about 3.5 hours, 4 hours. Did you like it?
Not
It-
really.
It's really a well done movie, and if it was half as long, I think it just goes on.
It's like got bored halfway through it.
Oh God, it's like 4 hours. It won it won every Academy Award. This was a big hit. The other colorized movie that year, 36, big deal. It was not very popular. You might have heard of it, called The Wizard of Oz. And I love The Wizard of Oz. Wizard of Oz is fantastic. I'll tell you about that. Remember that thing I told you about populism? It's all about populism. But the last couple things we'll get to for the bell rings. The White Citizens Council, and this would be in every town would come to greet people as they came in. And that's kind of this genteel racism up until the 1950s. The white elite control thing, kind of Bacon's rebellion thinking. Every town had this. So the White Citizens Council of Jackson, Mississippi welcomes you. And this was the sign that would be in front. Very clear what's going on. And remember Bacon's rebellion. And we'll come back to this. We'll talk about, there's so many, it comes in waves when we get to Little Rock Central High. So there's very genteel racism. But it wasn't like that it wasn't just in the South. The South, it's by law. In the North, there are some laws to restrict the races, but in the North, it's more sinister. Where's my mouse? Sundown towns. There were anything from 15,000 to 25,000 sundown towns, almost all of them outside the South. And so they're small towns to medium-sized towns. And they all had one basic rule. Only whites. Only whites lived there. And so this was the thing. Whites only after dark. So my dad in little town, my dad told you yesterday he was born on the little sharecropper's farm. When he was a little kid, actually during World War II, they moved to Louisville, Nebraska, town. They had about 2,000 people, now it's about 1,100. It's a little town, railroad town. And they had a sign like this on the edge of their town. It was no N-word after dark. That's what it said. And when he was a kid, must have been 43 or 44, some men who were working on the railroad, the Rock Island Railroad at that time, a lot of them were Hispanic or black, and they went into town, and mobs would beat them up and run them out. And they'd come back into town, like go to the bars after they worked, whatever. But one young black man was grabbed by people who probably friends of my grandfather. My grandfather was not part of this. But they grabbed him, beat him up, drug him out of town, and then sawed him in half on a barbed wire fence. I'm not even sure how that happened, but that's what happened. They lynched him. That's a lynching. And that's the town my dad grew up. But Helena was a sundown town. Mount City, but the town I grew up in was a sundown town. Glendive had a sign that said very much like my dad's sign, along the railroad, where the railroad and sundown towns. Great Falls was. Remember what I told you? There were larger populations of people of African or of Asian descent, and they ran them all out. Ran them out. And, okay, so I got to stop right there for Bell. Oh, no, let me get to this real quick. One more thing I got to get to is red line. And red line would be something that happened in big cities. The last thing I'm going to tell you for today, I know a lot of stuff. By the way, a year after that man was lynched, that my great-grandfather had a cross burned in his yard by the Klan. They thought he was a Mormon or a Jew. So they burned a cross in his yard. That was a little place outside of Louisville. He scared him off with a shotgun. Yeah, my dad vividly remembers coming to Sunday dinner and having to step over the ashes of the cross. The outline was still on the yard the next morning. But in large cities, there's a group, and let's stop during the Great Depression. And so the very mixed New Deal had the Federal Housing Administration that would help poor people buy homes. by providing insurance if you couldn't pay back your mortgage. So banks will give people who don't have a lot of collateral. Remember collateral? When my wife and I bought our first home, wow, a long time ago, in another century, but we got an FHA loan. So we were able to afford a new house. Big deal. Once you buy a new house, then you can use that to buy a bigger home or whatever. It's a big deal. But what they said was, in certain areas, they can't give them insurance. And they call these areas red areas here. Red areas, no insurance. Anybody want to guess who lived in these red areas? Huh? Yeah, black or Hispanic or, but yeah, mostly black. And you can imagine what happens. If you can't buy new homes or put money into a home, what happened to those neighborhoods? So it's going to be intensely segregated, even though that's not technically the law. And people are going to be stuck in poverty. If you can't buy a house or build value, you can't, not only are not have wealth for yourself, but you can't pass it on to your children. So this is actually a huge deal. If you ever go to a big city, we live in Montana, don't forget. When you go to a large city, and it's weird, you're driving along in a neighborhood that seems very, middle class and nice, and it's like you just cross a line. So my mom grew up in beautiful Omaha, and that's the way she was in her neighborhood. It was the white area, then the railroad tracks, and you didn't cross, and that's where African Americans were. And yeah. Okay, spread out. See you tomorrow. We got to do an essay again pretty soon. You want to do it on populism, progressives. We're going to do one on World War I already. That's already done, Dale. Maybe business growth. You guys decide. You want to do no essay?
Yeah.
All righty then. I'll see you right when you find work. Tomorrow, same time as I was doing on Wednesday.
Bye. Thank you.
Huh? Yeah, the rugby. Nazi play rugby. You play? You know what I mean? That's you see those rugby players and all far here.
Any year is freezing. Oh my God, this room is actually like summer home. It's because it's
that's cold.
It's because you actually turn off the heater. Yeah, my opinion.
What do you people want? You know what I'm wearing? My mask broke. My good mask broke, and that's where the paper masks are breathing a lot of paper.
That's in Helena too?
Huh? That's in Miles City, my hometown. Yeah. Right?
Probably, yeah.
Yeah, Miles City. They paid it at 15, about 15, 18. Have you been there?
No.
I'm getting so good at ceramics.
So I went there once, and it's
so good at ceramics.
it's pretty amazing.
Oh, you are?
It's wow, but it's just a mob, just a mob of people. So you got to be wearing pickpockets, and the priests who work there. You take out a picture, show your picture, and they'll tap you. They will jump into the crowd like this. I'll never forget that. You're not going to take pictures where people like, and then it's like, and they jumped on them, and they drug them out. And it's literally just shoulder to shoulder people, so they're jumping on like 10 people to get one person. They don't mess around in the Vatican.
That's not my fault.
Shut up. No, shut up. I'm not going to shut up. Shut up. End it right now.
Adam Florence. Botticelli. Oh, Alicia Cameron.